Hello, and welcome to the Empowered Couples Podcast, where here you get modern, non-boring relationship advice for you and your partner to communicate like pros, fight smarter, and stay on the same team, no matter the challenge that you face. I am one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman.
And I'm Jocelyn Freeman, but you all just know us as the Freemans. And today's topic is, what kind of sex are you in the mood for? Becoming more expressive with your partner. And this is actually going to be a special 3-part series where we bring on guests. So you're going to actually hear from some other couples who have experience with these specific topics. And today you're going to meet Seth and Melanie Studley. He is actually a licensed marriage and family therapist, and she joins him on their podcast and creating content for couples and other resources. And I love their honesty. They get real, they share examples of how to be expressive when talking about sex and intimacy, because passion doesn't just automatically stay there, right? It takes being open and vulnerable with each other about your wants and needs. So you're going to enjoy this couple, the Studleys, and you're going to enjoy this topic. Let's go ahead and dive in. Well, Seth and Melanie, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Hello, how's it going, you guys?
Really good. And our audience will get to know you a bit because we're going to share all the links to you and about Anatomy of Marriage. But we're excited to have you on the podcast, even though we have not had guests on for over a year now. So it's very special having you on.
Yeah.
And we were excited because you two talk about sex and intimacy. And specifically today, we're going to focus on how to talk to your partner more about what kind of mood you all have for sex. Ooh, what am I in the mood for today?
Yeah.
So before we ask you questions about that, I would love for our audience to hear about your personal journey as a couple in becoming more comfortable with sex and intimacy.
Okay, yeah. So just a quick little backstory. So my name is Seth, and we've been married for 16 years. We have 3 kids. I'm also a licensed marriage and family therapist, and we have a show called the Anatomy of Marriage podcast. And we had to absolutely create some kind of resources for other couples, because when we were going through a really hard time in our marriage, there weren't resources out there. So we turned our mess into our message and turned it on its head. So maybe you could tell a quick little backstory of how that happened.
Yeah. We created our show out of a need for content that helped couples who are sort of a little grittier than your average folks. If you could see us right now, you'd see that we're covered in tattoos. That doesn't mean we're like jailbirds or anything, but we don't look like your typical couple. And so as we were going through a tough season in our marriage, we were trying to find books, trying to find resources, and it just felt like nothing hit the mark.
Yeah.
And so that was when we got through all the hard stuff, we went, we can turn this into something helpful and constructive for marriages. And really, it was all based on having real, authentic, and raw conversations, including science into all of it, helping people break habits and all of that stuff. So that was what created our show. And from the show itself, actually, this is a fun backstory and how it relates to the conversation around sex and intimacy. We interviewed Dr. Tina Shermer Sellers at Seattle Pacific University. She was Seth's what is it? She was
one of
your
my professors in grad
professor.
school. Yeah.
And what was the class that she taught?
I think sexuality and therapy or
Right.
something
And
like that.
she taught sexuality and therapy. And Seth came home from school one day and he's like, I absolutely love my sexuality teacher. I'm like, what are you saying to
What
me?
is the problem?
What is going on here? And when we interviewed her on our show, she really revealed to us that I had come from a home that was sort of silent and shaming around sex and intimacy. You didn't talk about it. You didn't share about it. It was sort of taboo. Don't say anything. And Seth was kind of on the other end, where he grew up in the South. So it's hot. You swim all the time. You see bodies all the time. It's not weird. It's not bad. And so it was really interesting, because at first I didn't think that I had any sort of reservations around intimacy. I just didn't think I did. But when in reality, when I talked with Tina and we had her on our show, I was like, whoa, I have loads of hangups around this. And I am not having great sex, and we are not having great sex. So what can we do to fix it? And so that was our own show, was the start of our journey to being able to talk about sex and intimacy in a whole new way.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And not only in a whole new way, but the idea of connection and pleasure around sex and intimacy, right? Because sex, the design of sex is for connection, obviously physical connection, and in that comes emotional connection, and to some degree spiritual connection, and then also pleasure, like it feels good, right? So good sex, no matter what type of sex you're having, hopefully you are increasing connection with
Mm-hmm.
your partner and you're having pleasure with your
Right.
partner, right?
So before we go into that, because I want to get to the like highlights and the things to aspire for, but before that, you were sharing something powerful that I want to go more into about. I can't remember if you said specifically shame, but just it was a hush hush conversation.
Yeah.
You didn't talk about it in your house. And I want to unpack that a little bit more because Aaron and I had completely different experiences with sex and intimacy. Our
Mm-hmm.
listeners who've been, listening for a while know that Aaron was actually a virgin until we got married.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we got married, there was a lot to learn, right? And to
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
start from the beginning. So can
More
you
than learn, there was a lot of honestly shame and embarrassment for me
Right.
to acknowledge and work through as I
Right.
had hid this for a while, going through, I mean, later in high school and certainly through college.
Mm-hmm.
I'm basically the only one that I know that hasn't had sex, and that's including people that were going to church. So
Mm-hmm.
it
Right.
was embarrassing for me to share with anybody, even my close friends. So
Mm.
talk about having to learn something, it was even more unlearning a lot for me. And
Right.
I'm like, I mean, just because I stand here and we got married and now we're in the hotel room on our marriage night, it's like, well, what have I done to uncover and unpack all this shame?
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
so
Mm.
definitely.
yeah,
Absolutely.
share more
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah, well, one of the things that she mentioned was she said most people come from a home that is silent and shaming. And when she said that, because I went into the interview with her thinking I'm mostly fine around sex and intimacy, no big deal. But when she said that, it really struck a chord because I'm like, wait, we never had open, and I don't mean like weird open conversations. So that is not what I'm talking about. We never had balanced conversations. I didn't see my parents hug or kiss
Mm-hmm.
really ever.
Conversations around that were
Mhm.
not
Right,
normalized,
and they
right?
were shunned,
Mm-hmm.
and if there was something on TV where someone was kissing, even if it was just like in a normal TV show, there was a lot of change the channel, turn that off,
Mm.
right? And so what ends up happening is your body sort of keeps that, well, your body keeps the score. Your body
Right.
absorbs that information, oh, sex is bad. This is shameful. I should hide this. This isn't good. And so what was really interesting is when she said that, it kind of removed it sort of really opened my eyes to understanding some of the things that I was doing around intimacy that I was completely blind to. I had no idea that I was doing
Mm.
that. And then on top, a sort of additional layer on top of that was I was like, oh shoot, I'm doing this to our children.
Mm.
I'm telling, I'm accidentally, unintentionally shaming them for, being naked and they're little. So it's not like they should be shamed for that, but it was a cycle I was continuing because I was unaware of it.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's a real thing. And she actually wrote a book. Dr. Tina Shermer Sellers has a book called Sex, God, and the Conservative Church. And it's all
Mm.
about shame. It's called something, the subtitle is like Removing Shame from Sexuality or something like that. It's a great
Around
book.
Christian community and
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah. It's great.
What about Seth? What was your experience around sex? Were you more comfortable? I mean, I think men get this like, oh, men are like so comfortable with
Mm-hmm.
sexuality, right? That's how they're portrayed. So what was it like for you?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of mixed messages. Like growing up in the South, of course, in the Bible Belt, and we went to church. Like, oh, that's the worst thing you could ever do. But guess what? Every teenager wanted to do it, so it's like, okay, we also have bodies,
Right.
kind of thing. So it was a lot of don't do this, don't do this, and then of course we did. Then you feel like garbage about it because you're shamed or whatever. So there's a lot of guilt around that, around premarital sex and stuff. And then I'm thinking of a quote that one of our colleagues says, Dr. Corey Allen from Sexy Marriage Radio. He's like, sex is bad, sex is awful, don't do it, save it for the person you love,
Right.
right, in marriage. And I'm like, oh my goodness, that is such a mixed message. So that combined with like how normal pornography use was,
Mm-hmm.
it became like, oh, women, at least from a male perspective, it's like women are there to gratify guys, like, okay, you sleep with them, you don't have a relationship, you don't do this, or you watch them or whatever. And it's like a very transactional relationship in
Mm.
that way. So one thing that I had to do, not only was learn new concepts around sex and intimacy, but like you were saying, Aaron, unlearn stuff too. Like a lot of people think, we have all this focus on learning. Well, yeah, that's great. And we also need to focus on unlearning stuff too,
Mm-hmm.
because those old paradigms or negative narratives that we tell ourselves or that
Right.
we grow up with from family of origin or culture, they don't serve us anymore. So we need to get rid of those things.
Right.
Mm. So smart. And I think all of us have heard the term, intimacy is into me, you see,
Hmm.
Hmm.
which we really agree that it starts with your communication, your ability to share vulnerable things and create that emotional intimacy. Then, it seems like, okay, now we're in the mood. Let's have sex.
Hmm.
But I'm really excited to talk to you both because you say that there are actually different kinds of sex based on the mood. Dive into that because I think most
Right.
people feel like, oh, I'm in the mood, so that just means
Yeah.
one kind of sex or one
Right.
type.
Oh, this is so fun because Melanie like kind of came up. I don't know if she came up with the
Yeah.
idea, but it was new to us, and I was like, "Oh, this is
Right.
something.
Well,
Let's talk about
I'll
that."
tell you where it came from, and if there's any young mothers out there or moms who've had little children, they will know this feeling. So this idea came around when our youngest daughter was about, I don't know, maybe 3, and now she's 8. But so she was little, and I had other kids. So you're just like surrounded by humans, and they're touching you all the time. They have no sense of like where to touch you. They just little kids sometimes touch your butt, and
Little
you're like,
paws
what the
everywhere,
heck,
right?
So you feel like you're being touched all the time. People are talking to you all the time. And I remember Seth sort of hinting that he wanted to be intimate. And the thing that came out of my mouth was something along the lines of like, I am not interested in anything other than relaxation sex. And I was like,
Mm.
I said it and I was like, well, that's kind of profound.
Hmm.
Relaxation sex. Like I said it as a joke. And then I thought about it. I'm like, wait, that sounds lovely.
Hmm.
Like that this energy would be sort of restorative. It's not crazy. It's not, I don't even know. It's not, it doesn't take a lot of my energy. It actually, in fact, fuels me with energy. It gives to me, if that
Hmm.
makes sense. And so that was where the sort of spark of the idea came from, that there are different sort of energies around intimacy, that the experience can be a different thing than what we think of. And that allowed us to sort of expand our thoughts around and when I say type of sex, I don't mean like, I mean, some people think of acts. So that's where it gets
Hmm.
really tricky. I'm not talking about acts. I'm talking about energy, like the energy you bring to a thing. And
Right.
it's a lot like
Mm.
dancing. We talk about dancing in this, we use a metaphor a lot because you can do hip hop or tango or salsa or Irish clogging, I mean, it's all dance, but there's all
Or
different
slow
ways.
dancing.
Right,
Right.
exactly. And so there's all these different ways that one thing presents itself. And so even having the awareness that there are different ways to do it, different connections you want to feel is really transformative and helpful
Hmm.
for couples to get that connection and pleasure that we mentioned in the beginning.
Yeah.
So to go deeper into this, I often hear one partner saying, I don't feel like I want to turn my partner down, but yeah, I'm
Right.
exhausted at the end of the day. And so, can you describe how a partner could communicate without making their partner feel like it's an all or nothing thing?
Hmm.
How could they communicate that they're in the mood for just a certain type? And I'd actually like to hear from Seth because I
Hmm.
think it's often women that are nervous to say that to men. So,
Mm.
as a male, Seth, what
Hmm.
would be a better way to hear that your partner would really like only a certain kind of intimacy at the time?
Well, this is funny. I'm kind of chuckling, I guess. It's like, okay, so most men, I don't want to, pigeonhole everybody, but a high percentage of men usually have a higher desire, sex drive, right? So any type of sex that Melanie is interested, I'm like pretty much game, right? But there are different, because I don't feel like a pressure to say yes or no. It's
Right.
usually the opposite way around. But the idea of and when Melanie says like relaxation sex, we're not talking about like zen out kind of Kama Sutra or whatever we may think that. It's more of a, hey, this is a relaxing time to where we can just be quiet,
Hmm.
really appreciate one another, and like turn our brains off, but
Hmm.
still connect emotionally, physically. And even I really am interested in the spiritual aspect of
Hmm.
sex and intimacy too. So if Melanie says, hey, let's get crazy, then it's like
Sign me up.
fairly easy for me to respond. But if she says, hey, I would like to, hang out tonight, which is code for whatever, in a just a really kind of chill way, then I'm like, oh, okay, then I can get my mind kind of slowed down, like practice some
Hmm.
breathing, like, okay, take off my dad worker kind of family hat and put on the like connection hat with my wife and be able to be
Hmm.
100%
Right.
present. So that's
Right.
an aspect of how it would help me.
Yeah, and one of the things too I think is important is that clarity is kindness. So to be very clear with your spouse about the type of intimacy you would enjoy is very kind, because then they know, oh, this is the expectation. Gentle, kind, loving intimacy is what my wife is looking for. That's the expectation. If I show up with that energy, I win, right? Like, so clarity around that is really a kind thing to give to your spouse. A gentle sort of like, I would enjoy this type of intimacy or whatever. But I want to say something that has sort of popped up in my head over and over again. I made a declaration a while ago, probably, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, that I don't have bad sex. Right. So, and I want all y'all women to hear this. Don't have bad sex anymore. Don't give in if you're, and not that this happens to every woman. So please don't hear me saying that. And not all men are asking for sex and whatever. But if you are a woman and you are like, or you're a person and you're hearing your spouse say, I just want a quickie, or I just want whatever, and you know that it's not going to feel good to you, there's 2 things that you can do. Number 1, you say, no, let's save it for later and do it when we can both enjoy it. Or number 2, you say, I'm going to show up in a way that will make this experience also pleasurable for me. That takes a lot of ownership, sort of personal awareness, self-awareness. And sometimes if you
Is
are,
there some empowerment in there as well?
yeah, there, but, and it's not a, so when I say I don't have bad sex, it is all empowering. It's very much like, okay, well, if Seth wants to be intimate tonight and I'm not in the mood right now, but I don't want to have bad sex. I also don't want to have no sex. I got to show up. I got to, when I bring it, you get it, right? Like, I got to show up in a way that's going to make it so that I can have good sex. And that was a really, again, it was something that I said that I kind of blew my own mind with.
Yeah. So you have to be comfortable with the conversation
Right.
with yourself about sex, which
Absolutely.
is kind of trippy.
Yeah.
That's so powerful because in the beginning of a relationship, I feel like once we're together with somebody, then you've gotten past the phase where you can be quote unquote rejected. But as those get into relationship, and certainly as it comes to intimacy and sex, you really can feel rejected by your partner. And that actually happened to me earlier in our relationship. And it was more so because I was making a bid too subtle for Jocelyn to even recognize that it was
Right.
a gesture for sex, right? But besides that, it's powerful what you're saying, not to just tell your partner no, but to say something like, yes, I really appreciate, I acknowledge your bid for intimacy, and how about like a different time, or even getting into the conversation about the type of energy they feel like they want to enter into. So I think all of the people listening are like, well, what are the types? So you had mentioned like relaxation energy, but are there other types of energies that you have come to an awareness about?
Yeah, well, I would say it's, if you is a lot of it is based on what your needs are, right? What are you needing in that moment? And this takes some thought, some consideration. And the few ones that pop into my head right away is sometimes it's that high energy, like hanging from a chandelier vibes or whatever. But then other times it's that, like, I really deeply want to connect with you. I want to like feel like you see my spirit and I see yours, and we feel really in love. There's a healing intimacy, which people don't often think about, as well. If you've gone through a tragedy, there's a healing element to sexuality that is, when you understand that this is something that only my partner gives to me and I only give to them, that is a very loving and calming and soothing energy. But not if you're not aware of it, if that makes sense. What other ones can you think of?
Well, think about it as sometimes I'm in the mood for, a fat, let's see, In-N-Out burger. Oh, I did not mean to make that pun.
He
I
meant
did not
food.
mean-
He just meant food.
So like, okay, fast food. I'm gonna grab Chick-fil-A, right?
Right.
Or hey, we're gonna go to this 5-course meal. I made reservations. So that's like, okay, we're gonna slow down. We're gonna really connect. Or sometimes, I mean, it's not like we can't have connection and pleasure with whatever type of sex we're having.
Actually,
we just want to make sure that both of those elements are present.
Yes, let
in
me
any
comment
kind.
on that, because connection and pleasure really is the goal. Oftentimes people get it really twisted up and they think orgasm is the only goal. And it's not. Connection and pleasure is the only thing I want you to think about in any intimate relationship. And that doesn't even mean that you have to actually be having sex. There are couples where there's all sorts of issues going on and they can't actually have intercourse, but they can still have deep and meaningful connection and pleasure. And if we could focus our attention on connection and pleasure versus orgasm or whatever else the thing is, it will change how we do everything in intimate relationships. And that's one of the biggest sort of takeaways that I wish people could understand is that connection and pleasure, and it's different every day. Every moment we need a different type of connection and pleasure with our spouse. So learning the skills of being able to identify that in yourself, share it lovingly with your spouse. Make sure you're sharing it in a way that they understand it, right? So the cues aren't too small or whatever. And then meeting your spouse in that way and vice versa. So there's an art to it. It's like kind of like a like dance. I mean, it's like learning dance.
Yeah, you move here, I move there. I like what you said, Aaron, about the bids, and of course that goes back to Gottman's work, bids for connection and stuff. And it's really interesting and takes a high amount of insight, saying, "Oh, my bid wasn't strong enough. It wasn't her rejecting me. I need to do a little bit of work there." You know what I'm saying? So be really clear on your bid. Like you said, Melanie, clarity is kindness.
Right.
And those bids for connection. Of course, we get into trouble when we're doing very clear bids for connection and we're
it's
getting
being
rejected over and over. Then that's a whole different
Right.
conversation.
And I want to say, I'm so sorry we talk so much. One of the things I really want to say is I want to encourage couples to talk about sex and intimacy when they are not going to be intimate. Get used to, and that's actually, we have an app called the Anatomy of Marriage app, and it has sex and intimacy conversation starters for this very purpose. You're not intended to use them right before you have a sexual encounter, although you could. They're really intended to make talking about sexuality and intimacy with your spouse less terrifying.
It's normalizing the conversation, right? Normalizing the feelings. If I grew up in a family of origin that kind of felt awkward or shaming, okay, well, I'm going to rewrite that for my own marriage. Let's begin to normalize these conversations. And it's the work.
Right.
We have to do it.
So as busy parents, you have 3 kids and you have businesses. How do you talk about it? Like in terms of, so another couple that we have a great relationship with who also educates a lot on sex and intimacy, and they have children, they actually talk about it ahead of time, like almost like schedule it for the week, but yet they are very exploratory in their sex and intimacy. So it's not like super sterile, but what I'm curious is, do you two talk about sex and intimacy even before the evening and kind of talk about whether you're intending to be intimate that night or not?
We don't talk about it in that way as much, but one thing I do want to mention, that the idea of scheduling sex, people tend to look at that and frown upon it. They think, oh, well, that's weird. It takes out the whatever. But have you ever scheduled a fancy steak dinner or a date? Like, just because it's on your calendar does not mean that it's not going to be fun and great and amazing. Like the Oscars are scheduled, right? Things that are great are on calendars and scheduled. So don't be afraid to schedule intimacy. But I think for us personally, like, because oftentimes in a relationship, one of the spouses is less interested in intimacy and sex than the other. And we have found a nice rhythm where we're both interested in it, and we're both interested in, I think, and it came a lot from when I decided I would not have bad sex anymore, that essentially if Seth hints that he would like sex, I go, all right, I'll make that happen. And then we kind of, later in the night, we know, oh, this is going to happen. And it's because we've had hours and hours and hours and hours of conversations around sex.
It's one of those funny things. Like I advocate for scheduled sex, and it is something with my therapy clients and with our coaching clients, but it is something that we have never put on the schedule just for some reason or other. Well, we have a pretty healthy sex life, of course, but I guess I'll go on record saying, let's try scheduling sex.
Sure.
Let's try it out.
We just never do it. We're like,
right.
But yeah.
Well, I do have a question that maybe I'm hearing it from the audience listening, but it seems like when this conversation comes up, especially for parents, the conversation is there about whether you should do it, have a conversation around kids. So ultimately, is this something that you just talk about between yourselves and really try to keep separate? Obviously, probably a certain age, but what's this sort of healthy conversation or openness that really opens then the door for future generations to have such a healthy relation to sex when they're older?
Right. Well, one of the best things ever, and again, this goes back to Tina Shermer Sellers. When we interviewed her, I immediately felt all this guilt and shame because of how we were parenting our children around their bodies, right? And so I asked her, what do I do? What book do I read? Whatever. And she said, it's a book called Amazing You by Dr. Gail Saltz. We actually had her on our show to talk about it. And it's a body positivity book for children. So it's illustrated. It shows like, your ovaries and your whatever. And it's perfectly designed for children of a certain age to understand these things. And as your kids get older, so they talk about this concept of ages and stages. As their brain is ready to take on new conversations and topics and whatever, they'll let you know. they'll send out little cues. How do you get pregnant, right? They'll ask you,
Mm-hmm.
how do you get pregnant? And you gauge the conversation based on how old they are,
Mm-hmm.
based on what they can handle, always be appropriate, all of those things. But having conversations with your children around this kind of stuff that don't feel shameful,
Mm-hmm.
scared, like you can't say, don't ask that question.
Mm-hmm.
Don't talk about that. You shouldn't know that. That's going to shut your kid down.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to shut the conversation down.
And to a degree, pique their curiosity. Like,
Right.
oh, what is
Right.
that over there?
It'll have the
kind of
opposite
thing.
effect. Yeah.
And another thing that I'm thinking about too, it's not just one conversation
Oh,
like
yeah,
maybe
yeah.
culture or media would portray, like, oh, okay,
The talk.
have the talk, the
Right.
birds and the bees with
Oh,
your kid.
yeah.
It is 1,000 tiny micro conversations that begin to normalize this thing. And as Melanie was saying, ages and stages, you're going to temper your conversation to a 5-year-old versus our 13-year-old,
Right.
you know? Okay. And it's not just like, okay, buddy, we're going to go on a drive for an hour and we'll
Right.
talk about sex. No, it's just a bunch of small different conversations. And of course, we don't, talk about our own sexual life, in front of the kids. That'd just be kind of, weird. But yeah, that's a really good question
Right.
to
But
begin to normalize that idea.
We do normalize like hugging. We make sure that physical intimacy, like that is appropriate around little kids, is there. We talk about it. We will say like, oh, I love daddy so much, I'm going to give him a hug, right? And we'll talk about those kinds of things. And then I think too, if the kids see stuff in media that they have questions about, we'll address it appropriately, help them understand it. And no child develops at the same rate. No child develops at the same rate as their sibling, even. So it's always important for parents to understand that each kid is developing at a different rate. So you can't just teach your 5-year-olds all the same thing when each kid is 5. Yep, they learn about this. That's
Right.
not how it works. Some kids' brains aren't ready till they're 7, or 10 or whatever. So yeah, I think that's a great question, though. There's so much we could talk about about that.
Well, this is really one of the best pieces of advice I've heard around this topic because, man, I think for many of us, I'm going to say males because that's what I am, and being our age, there was that one sex talk. And I remember my dad sitting me down, and it only happened one time, never talked about again. And it was like so traumatic,
Oh
which I
no.
think it's that way for, I mean, many of us that had that conversation with our dad. But what you're saying is if you have smaller micro conversations throughout their life, certainly all appropriate, it becomes something that's not scary or traumatic. So I really had never heard anyone in any book or podcast say that. So I appreciate you both so much. One of the best pieces of advice I've heard around this.
So
Yeah.
as a closing question, because I know we could talk to you guys for a while, and we like to give our listeners a nugget that they can listen to briefly. So if you were to just synthesize it down into a couple of short questions that a partner could go ask their other partner today or share, what would be like 2 questions you'd offer the couples listening to ask each other around sex and intimacy?
That is a great question.
Go ahead.
Well, the one that came into my mind, I would like. I'm just thinking about our coaching clients. Actually,
Right.
like I would like my husbands, my dudes that I work with, to go ask their wives, "Hey," and of course this isn't in a weird way. It's not like right before bed or anything. It's like, "Can you tell me about a time when we've been intimate, when we've had sex, when you really felt connected and it was really enjoyable for you? Can you just tell me that, And then so our husbands, our guys are information gathering, right? So I'm going to listen to what my wife says around that and then go back and try to replicate that to make her experience more enjoyable and connecting.
Right. I think I guess both genders could do this, but a question that I think is so wonderful to ask is in the moment, say, what type of touch would make you feel really good right now? Because in any given moment, it's different. And I think that that's just a really easy say. It's awkward to do at first because you're like, what the heck am I doing? But it's, I think, a really great invitation to sit closely with one another, think deeply about what actually would make me feel better. And it gets you in touch with your body. And the funny thing, obviously, about talking about sex and intimacy with your spouse is it has the wonderful side effect of tending to make you want it. And so it's a good thing to get in the habit of actually talking about what kind of connection would feel good tonight. What would bring you pleasure? And it sounds like a weird sentence, but Try it out.
No, I love that. Great questions, both of you. And I know that you have a wealth of information. And so you mentioned your podcast already, which we will put in the show notes, the Anatomy of Marriage podcast and the Anatomy of Marriage app. Is there any other place that people should connect with you?
Yeah, we just launched 2 new podcasts this year, in fact, and it's a project that we've been meaning to do for a long time. It's called Anatomy of Family, where we talk about parenting, all kinds of stuff. How do we talk to our kids about sex? And sometimes our kids are even on the show, which is super fun.
Right.
And then also another new podcast, Anatomy of Sex, and that is where we even take deeper dives into everything sexual within marriage, and that's a lot of fun too.
Yeah, it's great. So you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and our website is actually it's thestudleys.com now. We changed everything to the Studleys. We're following your trend.
Right. STUDLEYS,
Yeah.
the Studleys, or you can also still find it at anatomyofmarriage.com, Instagram, Facebook, all the places.
I love that. Well, thank you both for taking the time to be on our podcast. We'll make sure that everyone can find those links in the show notes. And it's really exciting to continue to build a friendship with you guys, and excited to see what's in store for all of us in the future. Thanks again.
Thank you
you guys
so much
too.
for having us.
Thank you. Absolutely.
All right. Talk to you later.
Take care.
Before we close it out, we wanted to say that we know sometimes talking about sex and intimacy, or just challenging or somewhat triggering conversations, might not be going as well as you'd like it to in your relationship, but you don't have to stay stuck there. So we actually wanted to extend our support and let you know that we have opened up a couple of spots this month to do private sessions with new couples. And so if you didn't know, you can actually schedule an introductory session with us with a low investment so that you can see our style works in helping you understand each other and have conversations that you typically don't get any resolution around. So you can go to meetthefreemans.com/coaching, pick a date and time that works for you, and we will support you in getting to a place of understanding each other and having some next steps to take as a couple. So that's meetthefreemans.com/coaching. And with that, we'll talk to you all on the next episode.